I've always considered myself a logical person. Growing up, I never put much stock in ghost stories or supernatural things. But that all changed when I had an experience that I'll never forget. It was a night like any other when I moved into an old house in a small town in the Midwest. The house was charming in a rustic way, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off as the house's age and settled in. It started with little things. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. The creaking floors, the cold drafts when there was no window open, the way the lights flickered, even when the wiring was fine. But I quickly learned that these weren't just oddities of an old house. They were signs of something much darker. I remember the first time I really noticed it. One night, after I had just finished dinner. I had been unpacking boxes all day and was exhausted. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft knock at my door. At first I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. My heart began to race. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I opened the door, but there was no one there. I looked down the hall and everything was still. I stepped out into the hallway, thinking maybe it was one of my neighbors playing a prank, but it was just the dark, quiet house. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. But over the next few weeks, the occurrences became harder to ignore. I started hearing whispers when no one was around, like a conversation just out of earshot. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the whispers became more distinct, more frequent. I heard them most often at night, when I was alone in bed. They would start as soft murmurs, then grow louder and clearer, until I could almost make out words. And the worst part was that they always seemed to come from the corners of the room, the places where the shadows were the darkest. One evening, after hearing the whispers for what felt like hours, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly crept through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though something was pressing down on me. I checked every room, every closet, even under the beds, but there was no one there. Still, the whispers continued. That night, I barely slept, my eyes darting around the room, listening for any sign of movement. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I found myself constantly on edge, my nerves frayed. I couldn't explain it, but something was off. That's when I started noticing the footprints. At first, I thought I had simply missed them, but after a few days, I realized they were always in the same places, leading up to my bedroom door, appearing on the stairs, sometimes in the kitchen where I would never leave a mark. The footprints were faint but distinct, bare, muddy footprints, as though someone had walked through the house without shoes. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind again, maybe I was imagining it all. But the marks were real. The whispers were real. And soon, the nightmares began. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, it was the shadowy figures I saw in my dreams. They were tall, dark, and featureless, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. They would stand in the corner of my room watching me, waiting. Every night, they grew closer. I could feel their presence pressing on me, suffocating me, until I would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. But even when I woke up, it felt like they were still there, lingering just beyond my vision. One night, after another restless sleep, I decided to do some research. I dug through the local library and asked around about the house. What I found shocked me. The house had a history, a dark one. It had once been the home of a family who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. There were rumors about the house being haunted, but no one could ever confirm the details. The family had simply vanished one night without a trace. The police had searched the house for weeks, but they never found any sign of foul play. The only thing they found was a strange symbol carved into the wall of the basement. I didn't know if the stories were true, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had taken over me. I had to know more, so I visited the old house on the outskirts of town where the family had lived. The place was abandoned now, a crumbling shell of its former self. As I stood outside, the hairs on my neck stood up. There was an oppressive energy around the place, a feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far bigger than I could understand. That night, things took a turn for the worse. I returned home, shaken by my visit, and decided to do one last sweep of the house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I needed to feel like I was in control again. As I walked through the darkened halls, I heard it again. The knocking. It was coming from the basement. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door. The air around me seemed to grow colder with each step. I opened the door to the basement, and the temperature dropped instantly. My breath formed clouds in the air as I descended the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand. The basement was dimly lit, filled with dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was the wall in the far corner. The symbol, the same one I had read about in my research, was etched into the stone. It was a twisted, intricate design, as though it had been carved by something other than human hands. As I stepped closer, I could feel a pressure building in my chest, like something was trying to push me away. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices rising in intensity. My flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I froze, unable to move, as the temperature plummeted even further. I could feel the presence of something in the room with me, something old and angry. And then, in the darkness, I heard it, a soft whisper just inches from my ear. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me as I fled into the night. I never returned to that house again. It felt like the house was calling me, trying to draw me back into its grip. The whispers, the cold, the shadows, they followed me, haunting my every step. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know who or what was there with me. All I know is that some things can't be explained, and some doors are better left closed.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not in the way people think of them. I'd always chalked up stories of haunted houses and strange occurrences to imagination, stress, or old houses falling apart. But the events I'm about to tell you, they shook me to my core. It started in the fall of 2015. I had just moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. The place was cheap, run down, but it had charm. The original owner, an elderly woman named Edna, had passed away about a year before, and the house had been empty ever since. The real estate agent assured me there was nothing wrong with the place. Sure, the floors creaked and the wallpaper was peeling in spots, but nothing that would raise red flags. The first few weeks were fine. Quiet. I started to feel comfortable in the space. Even found a few hidden treasures in the attic. Old books, a vintage record player, some furniture that had seen better days, but still had a certain appeal. The neighbors were kind enough, though no one visited my house. The atmosphere was isolated, a perfect retreat for someone like me who just wanted to escape the noise of city life. But after a while, I started hearing things. Nothing too alarming at first, just small noises in the dead of night. A knock, a creak, something sliding across the floor when there was no breeze. I'd brush it off, tell myself it was the house settling. It was an old place, after all. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, reading, I heard it. A soft tapping at my window. It was subtle, rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. I froze, thinking it was just a tree branch brushing against the glass. I didn't want to look, but curiosity got the best of me. I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. No branches, no movement, just an empty yard bathed in the pale moonlight. I laughed to myself, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. I was just tired, that's all. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to a person's mind. But the tapping didn't stop. It was a few nights later when it happened again. The tapping was louder this time, more urgent. I lay there in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled the curtain open again, this time with more hesitation. The yard was still, the darkness consuming everything outside. I stood frozen for a long moment until a shape moved in the corner of my eye. It was a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just inside the tree line. At first, I thought it was a person, but the more I stared, the more it seemed like a shadow, a blur, like something out of place. It didn't have any real shape, just the faintest outline of something hunched over, unnaturally still. I couldn't see its face, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly shut the curtain, retreating to my bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, night after night, louder and more persistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, as I was walking through the kitchen, I heard footsteps upstairs. I was certain I was home alone. I froze in place, the sound of someone walking around above me sending chills through my body. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, my mind racing, wondering if someone had broken in. But when I reached the top, the house was empty. Every room was still. Yet the footsteps had been so distinct, they had sounded so real. I checked every room in the attic, the basement, even under the beds and inside closets, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Nothing. That's when I noticed the mirror in the hallway. It wasn't big, just a simple full-length mirror, but it had always been there, hanging crookedly as if it had been there for decades. As I passed it, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, something standing right behind me. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. I went back to my room that night, trembling in the silence. But the tapping started again, louder this time, coming from the direction of the kitchen. It wasn't just tapping, it sounded like scraping now, something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the real estate agent. She was quick to reassure me that the house was safe, that nothing had ever happened here that was out of the ordinary. But she also told me something that struck me as odd. Edna was a recluse, she said. She didn't have much contact with anyone in the neighborhood. But I remember hearing some strange rumors when she passed. People would talk about things, you know? People said she was a bit unusual. I asked her what she meant by that, but the agent didn't want to get into it. She quickly ended the call, leaving me with more questions than answers. The following day, I took a walk around the neighborhood, asking a few of the neighbors if they had ever heard anything about Edna. Most of them avoided the topic. One neighbor, a man in his 60s, finally relented and told me something that made my blood run cold. Edna, she used to live alone, always kept to herself. But there were whispers, he said, looking around like he was making sure no one could overhear. Some of the people who lived in the house before her said that she used to hold rituals, strange things in the dead of night. Some people claim they heard chanting, others said they saw lights flickering at odd hours, but no one dared to ask her about it. She had a way of making people stay quiet. Rituals? Chants? I couldn't make sense of it, but it was enough to make me doubt my decision to live there. I went back home that night, hoping to find some peace. But as soon as I opened the door, the temperature in the house dropped. It was a sharp, biting cold that made my breath visible in the air. I thought maybe the heating system had malfunctioned, but as I stepped further inside, I heard the scraping noise again. It was coming from the living room now. I didn't want to investigate. I should have turned around and left, but something made me walk toward the noise. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I had to know. I stepped into the living room, and the sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. The furniture, which I had left in place just hours before, was rearranged. The chairs were all facing the center of the room, and in the middle of the floor was a large, old-fashioned rug I hadn't seen before. It was placed in a perfect circle, and inside the circle, the carpet had been torn up, revealing the old, dusty floorboards beneath. I felt a presence behind me, a cold, overwhelming feeling. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was, the shadow. The same figure I had seen in the yard, now standing right in front of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure seemed to shift, its outline growing clearer as it stepped closer. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its voice, a raspy whisper. "Leave this place," it said. "You are not welcome here." I couldn't move. My legs were frozen. The figure's hand reached out toward me, and I felt an unbearable weight on my chest, like something was pressing me into the floor. My vision blurred, my mind raced, and then nothing. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in the middle of the night, alone on the floor. The house was still, but I could still feel it, that presence lingering in the shadows. I knew I had to leave. I packed up as fast as I could the next morning, not bothering to clean or gather everything. I just wanted to get out. I left the house behind, and I've never been back. I don't know what Edna was doing in that house or what she summoned, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't done with me. It still follows me. It's been years, and sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I feel it again, just the faintest tapping, the softest scraping, a reminder that the darkness is still out there, watching.
Next story.
It was a late autumn evening when I first noticed the oddities in the house. I had just moved into this secluded farmhouse on the edge of town. The place had been empty for years before I found it listed online, and despite its aging structure and faded charm, I was drawn to it. The price was a steal, and the isolation was exactly what I needed. Away from the chaos of city life, a place to recharge. At least that's what I thought. The first few days went by quietly. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of wind whistling through the trees outside became a constant companion. I spent the afternoons exploring the property, getting acquainted with the sprawling woods behind the house and the small pond on the far edge of the land. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, perhaps. One evening, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, I heard a soft tapping coming from the hallway. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of someone lightly knocking on a door. I turned off the stove, stood still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Shrugging it off as the house settling, I went back to cooking. But the next night, it happened again. Only this time, it was louder, more persistent. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked to the hallway, thinking maybe there was a window slightly open or something else causing the noise. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the house silent except for the faint creaking of the wooden floors. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe it was the wind again, I told myself, or perhaps a small animal outside, but it was unsettling. Still, I ignored it and returned to my evening routine. It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel a creeping unease. The tapping began again, only this time it wasn't just from the hallway. It seemed to echo throughout the house, bouncing from room to room as if something or someone was moving around. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear if there was any sound at all. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a deep thud followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the floor. That was when I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided I had to investigate. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but there had to be an explanation for what was going on. I checked every room in the house, every closet, every attic, and even the basement, but found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no strange markings, no signs of recent disturbance. The house felt normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my perception. Later that week, I called the previous owner to ask about the house's history. The man who had sold me the place was kind enough to speak with me, but when I mentioned the noises, his tone grew cold. "You hear tapping?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. "And dragging sounds?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. He sighed heavily, as if weighing something in his mind. "There's something you should know. The house, it's been in my family for generations. It's been empty for a while because my great-uncle lived there before me. And, well, he died under strange circumstances." I leaned in, eager for more information. "He was a recluse," the man continued, his voice quivering slightly. "He kept to himself mostly, never had much company. But every now and then, he'd mention hearing things at night, scratching sounds, tapping, whispers. I thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but one day, we found him dead in his study." His face was contorted in fear, like he had seen something horrible. I was silent for a long time, processing what I had just heard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to unsettle me. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk in the woods behind the house, trying to clear my mind. The autumn air was crisp, and the rustling of leaves was oddly soothing. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I found something strange. A small clearing appeared before me, and in the center of it was a decayed wooden post, almost like a small shrine. It was old, weathered, with faded carvings on its surface. Curiosity overtook me, and I walked closer to inspect it. The carvings seemed to form words, old words, words I couldn't quite understand. I traced my fingers along the edges, feeling a faint vibration beneath my fingertips. That's when I felt it. A shift in the air, like the temperature dropped suddenly. I pulled my hand away quickly. Heart racing. Something about the place felt wrong. I turned around to leave, but the moment I looked back, I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, its outline blurred by the mist. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally still, watching me from a distance. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back to the house, my thoughts a whirlwind. It was becoming impossible to ignore the fact that something in this place was reaching out to me, something I couldn't explain. That night, the tapping grew louder again, more frantic, as if whatever was haunting the house was growing restless. I grabbed a flashlight and headed straight to the basement, determined to find some logical explanation. The stairs creaked as I descended into the darkness. The basement smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. The light flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, but I pushed forward. At the far end of the basement, behind a stack of old crates, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the floor, was an old chest, one I hadn't seen before. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I reached for the lid. As I opened it, a cold wind swept through the room and I gasped in shock. Inside the chest were old bones, human bones, the remains of what seemed to be a body, half dissolved by time, still wrapped in tattered rags. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the tapping began again, this time all around me, louder and faster. I could feel something moving toward me in the darkness, dragging its weight across the floor. I didn't need to see it. I could feel it. I turned and ran up the stairs, bursting out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stay in the house after that night. I couldn't. The air in that place had changed. It felt alive, suffused with a cold, malevolent presence that I couldn't explain. I left, locking the door behind me and driving as far away as I could. To this day, I don't know what it was that haunted that farmhouse or why it reached out to me. But I know this, I will never return. The tapping, the dragging, the bones in the basement, they will always be with me, haunting the edges of my memory.
Next story.
I don't know if you're the type of person who believes in ghosts or not, but after what happened to me, I can't look at the world the same way. I used to be a skeptic, thought it was all nonsense, just stories people tell around campfires or on late-night horror podcasts. But after that night, I don't know. I guess I still don't understand it, but I can't deny what I experienced. It was about a year ago when everything changed. I was living in a small house on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, just a 2-story with a porch that creaked every time someone stepped on it. I'd recently moved there, hoping to escape the chaos of city life. At first, it felt peaceful, quiet, serene, the kind of place where you could hear the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets at night. But that calm was shattered the moment I walked through the door. The house had an old smell, like a mix of wood, dust, and something else. Something faint but unmistakable, like a trace of rot. I convinced myself it was just the age of the place, nothing to worry about. But then things started happening. Small things at first. Little noises when I was home alone, scratching sounds coming from the walls. I thought it was just rodents or maybe the house settling. But as the days went on, the sounds got more intentional. The first real event occurred about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. I froze. I lived alone. There was no one else in the house. My heart started racing as I waited, listening. The footsteps grew louder, like someone was walking from room to room. I didn't move. I couldn't. I had this paralyzing feeling that if I got up to check, I would regret it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house. Old homes make noise, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But the next night it happened again, and again the night after that. This time I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was dark and the air was heavy, like it was thick with something. Something that didn't belong. I checked every room, every closet, even the attic. Nothing. No one was there. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it, but then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. It was like someone was behind me, just out of sight. I went back downstairs, my mind racing, but I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. The incidents continued over the next few days, each one more unsettling than the last. One night, I woke up to hear my name being whispered from the corner of my room. I opened my eyes, my body frozen with fear. The whispering was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, soft and coaxing. "Come here," it said. I pulled the blankets over my head and shut my eyes tight, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had just gotten into bed, and I was about to fall asleep when I felt the distinct pressure of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped, the bed frame creaked under the weight. I was paralyzed. I didn't dare open my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but I could feel it. Whatever was sitting there, just inches from me, breathing softly in the darkness. When I finally worked up the courage to open my eyes, nothing was there. But the pressure on the bed lingered, as though someone had just gotten up and walked away. At this point, I knew something was wrong. I started doing some research about the house. I combed through local records looking for anything that could explain the strange events. It wasn't long before I found something. The house had been built in the early 1900s, and the previous owner had died in the house under strange circumstances. They said he'd been an old man living alone after his wife passed away, and that he had fallen ill. The neighbors claimed they'd heard him screaming late into the night before he died, but no one had ever investigated. The more I read, the more I realized something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an undeniable pull to the house's past. It was like something was tethering me to it, something I couldn't see but could certainly feel. And then one evening, it all came to a head. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I felt a cold gust of air rush past me. The windows were all shut. I turned around, but the door to the basement, one I'd never opened, was standing ajar. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone near it. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. I knew I should just walk away, ignore it, but my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended into the basement. The air down there was thick, damp, and stale. The floor creaked beneath me, and the light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move. As I explored the basement, I found nothing out of the ordinary at first. Old boxes, broken furniture, the usual. But then I saw something odd. In the far corner of the room, there was a small door, one that was barely noticeable. It was hidden behind a pile of old furniture, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Without thinking, I walked over to it and pulled on the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, narrow room. Inside, there was a single chair in the center, and on the floor, a large stain that looked like dried blood. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I stepped inside. And that's when I saw it, a photo on the wall. A faded photograph of a man, an older version of the man I'd read about in the records. He was sitting in the same chair that stood in the middle of the room, his eyes dark and hollow, staring directly at the camera. His face twisted into a grimace, as though something was terribly wrong. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in front of me. I took a step back, but my foot hit something. When I turned to look, I saw an old wooden box lying on the floor. My hand reached down, almost on its own, and as soon as my fingers touched it, a sharp pain shot through my wrist. It was like the box was alive, trying to pull me into it. I yanked my hand away, but the pain didn't stop. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder. My name, my full name. I stumbled backward, feeling like I was suffocating under an invisible weight. I didn't look back as I ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind me. I never went back down there again. That night, I packed my things. I didn't care about the house anymore. Didn't care about the life I'd tried to start there. I just had to leave. I wasn't going to stay in that place for another minute. I don't know if I was running from the house or from something in me, something that had been drawn to that place, to the ghosts that still lingered there. I don't know where I went wrong. But whatever it was, it's still with me. Every now and then I feel the cold gust of air, hear the whispering in the corner of the room, or see that face in the dark. I try not to think about it, but I know it's always there, lurking, waiting for me to make a mistake. I never should have gone into that basement. But now I wonder if it even matters. Maybe I was meant to find it all along.
Next story.
I've never told anyone this before, and honestly, I'm not sure why I'm telling you now. Maybe it's because I'm hoping that by sharing it, I can make sense of what happened. Or maybe it's because I can't keep it bottled up any longer. Either way, you deserve to know. It started a few months ago. I had just finished my shift at the bar and was driving home late at night, the streets almost completely empty except for the occasional stray car. I lived on the outskirts of town in a small, rundown neighborhood, the kind where the houses are close together but feel miles apart in the quiet of the night. It was peaceful in a way, and after a long day, I appreciated the solitude. I'd taken this route home 1,000 times, but that night, something was different. As I drove past the old church on the corner, I saw a figure standing by the gate, just standing there in the darkness. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was wearing a long white dress, her hair dark and tangled, almost hanging in front of her face. At first, I thought it was just some homeless woman, maybe looking for shelter. But then, as I got closer, I felt that unmistakable chill. The kind of chill that runs down your spine and makes the hairs on your neck stand up. It was like I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see her face. I drove by quickly, telling myself I was just imagining things, but something kept nagging at me. I felt an urge to turn around to see if she was still there. I ignored it at first, but the thought wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to shake it off, but my foot seemed to guide the car back around the block, almost on its own. When I turned back onto the street near the church, I saw her again, standing in the same spot. But this time, there was something different about her. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she was listening for something, waiting for something. I stopped the car. I don't know why. It was stupid, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to know who she was, what she was doing there, especially in the middle of the night. I got out of the car and walked toward her. I was hesitant, my footsteps slow and cautious. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. Her dress was torn in places, and her skin looked off, like it was pale in a way that didn't look natural. Her hair was tangled, matted against her face, but I couldn't see her eyes, just the outline of her face in the dim light of the street lamp. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She didn't respond. I was too close now to turn back. There was something about her that was pulling me in, something I couldn't explain. I took another step forward, and that's when everything changed. Without warning, she turned toward me. Her eyes, when I saw them, I froze. They were black, completely black, like there was no white at all. Her face twisted into something that wasn't human anymore. Her mouth stretched wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. She took a step toward me, and that's when I heard it, a voice, but not from her lips. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, filling my mind. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, and for a moment I thought I was going to fall into some kind of hole, like the earth was swallowing me whole. My breath was coming in short gasps now, and I could feel my knees shaking, my entire body screaming at me to get away. But I couldn't move. Then, as quickly as it had all started, she was gone. One moment, she was right in front of me, and the next, nothing. Just the empty street and the faint smell of something rotten in the air. I don't remember how I got back to my car, but somehow I found myself sitting in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I started the engine and drove away, not once looking back. But the thing is, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her eyes looked, the way her mouth had stretched, her teeth gleaming in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, like I had disturbed something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Had I just snapped from exhaustion? I couldn't tell, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those black eyes staring at me, accusing me. The days after that were a blur. I tried to go on with my life, pretending it hadn't happened, but the feeling never left. It followed me just beneath the surface. I began noticing strange things. Whispers in the night, the sensation of someone watching me, cold spots in my apartment. I even started hearing the voice again, sometimes when I was alone, sometimes when I was with people. The words were always the same, "You shouldn't have come back." It was like I was cursed. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape her. I started seeing her in reflections when I passed by a window or caught my own image in a mirror. Her face would flash for just a moment, her black eyes staring back at me. But it wasn't just me. I started hearing stories from people in town. Stories about strange encounters with a woman in white. People who'd seen her in their rearview mirrors or standing in the shadows of their own homes. Some said she was a ghost. Others said she was something much worse. A demon, maybe, or a vengeful spirit. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that she was real and she was coming for me. I went to the church, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could find some answer, some way to make it stop. But when I stepped inside, I felt the air change. It was thick, oppressive, like the church was holding its breath. I walked down the aisle looking for anyone who could help, but the pews were empty and the altar was bare. There was no one there. That's when I heard her voice, soft and distant, echoing through the empty church. "You can't run from me." I ran. That night, I packed everything I could and left town. I didn't care where I went anymore, as long as it was far from that place. I drove through the night, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see her there, standing in the darkness, just waiting. I still don't know what she was or why she came after me. All I know is that I can't escape her. Wherever I go, she's there, lurking just beyond the corner of my vision, her black eyes watching me. And every time I close my eyes, I hear the same whisper, "You shouldn't have come back."
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. I mean, sure, I'd heard the stories, seen the movies, but I thought it was all just exaggerated nonsense. That is, until I moved into the house on Elm Street. I was in my late 20s when I found the place. It was an old Victorian-style house, charming in its own way, with ivy creeping up the sides and the kind of architecture that made you feel like you were walking into another era. The price was more than reasonable, and I was tired of apartment living, so I jumped on the opportunity without giving it much thought. I figured it was just an old house that needed a little TLC, and I was up for the challenge. The first few weeks were great. The house was spacious with hardwood floors that creaked just enough to remind you it was alive. The neighbors were friendly, always waving when I walked out to get the mail, but no one ever really stopped to chat. It was peaceful. But after a while, I started to notice odd things. It started small, flickering lights, the sound of footsteps when I was alone. At first, I blamed it on the old wiring, or maybe my own mind playing tricks on me. But then the sounds became more distinct. I would hear someone walking around upstairs when I knew I was the only one there. It was the kind of sound that made your skin prickle, the heavy thud of footsteps on wooden floors, the kind of sound that didn't belong in an empty house. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe there were animals in the attic. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But that all changed one night. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard it, faint at first but unmistakable. A soft tapping, like someone knocking on the door. I got up, thinking it was a neighbor or maybe even a delivery. But when I opened the door, there was no one there, just the empty street, the night air crisp and still. I shook it off. Must have been the wind, I thought. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next few days, it happened again and again. Each time, I would open the door and no one would be there. Just the same eerie silence. Then, things escalated. One evening, as I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, I felt a chill wash over me. The air grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I glanced at the hallway that led to the stairs, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the top of the stairs. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, a shadow cast by the dim light of the hallway. But then the figure moved. It wasn't a blur, it wasn't a trick of the light, it was something real. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and the chill in the air seemed to grow colder. I couldn't look away, and for what felt like an eternity, the figure just stood there, staring down at me. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then, as if it were nothing, the figure vanished. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. But there was no explanation, no logical reason for what had happened. I backed out of the kitchen, my legs shaking, and grabbed my phone. I called my best friend, Karen. desperate for some kind of comfort. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Maybe you should come stay with me for a few days." I didn't want to be that person, the one who was so afraid of their own house that they needed to stay somewhere else. But I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in that house, not after what I had just seen. I spent the next few nights at Karen's, but when I returned to the house, it was different. The air felt heavy, oppressive. It was like the house had changed in my absence, as though it had become more alive, more aware of me. I had trouble sleeping, hearing things in the night that I couldn't explain. The sound of whispers, footsteps following me when I moved through the rooms, and the tapping. It was still there every night, persistent. But then, one night, I heard something different. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper coming from the corner of the room. It wasn't just a sound, it was words. "Get out!" The words echoed in my ears, and for the first time, I felt a true sense of terror. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and slowly turned to the corner where the voice had come from. There was nothing there. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. Something was holding me there, keeping me in that house like I was trapped. The next day, I went to the local library, trying to find any information about the house's history. I learned that the house had been built in the early 1900s, and that it had a long history of strange occurrences. Over the years, several families had lived there, but all had eventually moved out, citing unsettling events and unexplained happenings. But the most disturbing part of the history wasn't the strange noises or the figures in the hallway. It was the story of the previous owner, a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the house for decades. She was known to be a bit eccentric, but nothing unusual until the day she vanished. No one knew where she had gone, and after a while, people started to whisper about the house being cursed, haunted by Margaret's spirit. They said she had never left, that her presence lingered, waiting for someone else to come. That night, I stood in front of the house, staring at it from the street. I didn't know if I should be there anymore. The air felt thick, like the house was calling to me, demanding that I stay. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been haunting that house, whatever had followed me, wasn't going to let me go so easily. I packed up my things that night, leaving the house behind. The tapping stopped, the whispers faded, but something lingered with me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I didn't know if I had been haunted by a ghost, or if I had simply let my imagination run wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had wanted me to stay, that it had wanted me to become another part of its history. I moved into a new apartment, away from the house on Elm Street, but I still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, and I can't help but wonder if the house is still waiting for someone else to move in, to take my place.
Next story.
I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. I've spent most of my life dismissing ghost stories as nothing more than overactive imaginations and old wives' tales. But that all changed when I took a job as a night manager at a hotel in a small town upstate. The job seemed like the perfect opportunity. Quiet, steady work, and the pay was good. I had no idea what I was walking into. The hotel was old, built in the early 1900s, and had a certain charm to it. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls had a vintage feel that reminded me of something out of a classic horror film. But aside from a few oddities, it wasn't anything that struck me as particularly unusual. My shift usually started around 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The hotel wasn't very busy during the night, so I'd spend most of my time sitting at the front desk, reading or browsing on my phone. I'd check in the occasional guest, make sure everything was in order, and then wait for the hours to pass. It was on my second week that things started to get strange. It was a particularly quiet night. The hotel was almost empty, save for a few guests who had checked in earlier. I was behind the desk, reading a book, when I heard the soft sound of footsteps from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. But then the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, making their way down the hallway above me. I knew there was no one up there, no guests, and the housekeeping staff had already left for the night. I told myself it was nothing, just a noise from the old building. But the footsteps persisted. They were so real, so distinct. My heart started to race as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I stood up and walked to the staircase, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone up there?" There was no response, only the quiet sound of footsteps getting closer. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go upstairs and check it out. As I made my way up the stairs, the air grew noticeably colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the second floor, I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. I checked every room, one by one, but everything was locked. No one was there. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of unease stayed with me. I didn't mention it to anyone at work the next day. Maybe I had just been hearing things. But the following night it happened again. The same soft footsteps, the same cold air, the same feeling of being watched. This time I wasn't going to just let it slide. I began to look into the hotel's history, hoping to find some explanation for these strange occurrences. What I discovered was unsettling. The hotel had been the site of a tragic event many years ago, an unsolved murder. A young woman, a guest at the hotel, had been found dead in her room. The police never found out who was responsible, and the case was left open. The woman's name was Sarah, and her death had cast a long shadow over the hotel's history. As I dug deeper, I began to uncover even more disturbing details. Guests over the years had reported strange noises, unexplained cold spots, and an overwhelming sense of dread in certain rooms, particularly the one where Sarah had died. Some claimed to have seen a figure standing in the hallway late at night. Others heard soft whispers or felt an invisible presence pressing in on them. The more I learned, the more I couldn't deny it. Something was happening in that hotel, and I had no idea what I was up against. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the place. I stayed in the hotel after my shift ended, sitting in the lobby with the lights dimmed low. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. I watched the clock tick slowly, every minute stretching on forever. The hotel was eerily quiet. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. This time, I wasn't going to back down. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold air wrapped around me like a heavy blanket as I reached the second floor. I could feel the weight of the silence, the tension thick in the air. The footsteps continued, leading me to the hallway where Sarah's room was located. I knew this was it. The room at the end of the hall had been locked for years, the key lost in some forgotten drawer. I could feel the presence there. Heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting for me. I approached the door, flashlight shaking in my hand. As I got closer, I heard a faint whisper, just barely audible. "Leave." I froze. The voice was soft, almost a breath, but I could hear the desperation in it. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Should I leave? Should I run? But something deep inside me told me I had to go in. I reached for the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a room that had been untouched for years. The bed was still made, the curtains drawn tightly, and the air was thick with dust. But something was wrong. It wasn't just a room, it felt like a tomb. A cold, oppressive energy filled the space, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on me from all sides. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the window, a figure stood. It was tall, dark, and featureless. Just a shadow, shifting and moving like smoke. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my legs giving way beneath me. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond, but then something strange happened. The figure began to fade, becoming lighter, less substantial. It wasn't just a shadow, it was fading into the air, dissipating like mist. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. When I finally regained control of my legs, I turned and ran down the stairs, out of the hotel, and into the night. I never went back. I'm not sure what happened that night, whether it was Sarah's spirit or something else entirely. All I know is that the hotel was never the same after that. I quit my job shortly after, and the hotel eventually closed down. To this day, the building stands empty, a silent reminder of what happened there. If you ever find yourself driving through that small town, you might see the old hotel sitting at the end of the road. But don't stop. Don't go inside, because some things are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
I never considered myself a superstitious person. I was always the type to roll my eyes at ghost stories and dismiss anything that seemed too out of the ordinary. But I can't explain what happened to me in that house. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of it. It was early spring when I moved into that old, creaky house. I had been looking for a new place to live for weeks and had almost given up when I came across it. The listing seemed too good to be true. The rent was cheap, the house was spacious, and it was in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. I didn't ask many questions. The landlord, a man named Charles, was kind, a little odd, but nothing that raised any red flags. The house itself was a 2-story brick building that had clearly seen better days. The wallpaper was peeling and the floors were scuffed and worn, but there was something charming about it. It felt comfortable in an odd way. I didn't mind the imperfections. I just wanted somewhere to call my own. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet, the neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, and I quickly fell into a routine. But after a while, strange things started to happen. Little things at first. Objects out of place, creaky floors when no one was walking on them. At night, I would hear what sounded like faint whispers. But when I tried to pinpoint where they were coming from, I could never find the source. It wasn't until a week into living there that I began to feel truly uncomfortable. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard the front door creak open. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was the wind or the house settling. But when I got up to check, I saw the door was wide open. The wind wasn't blowing, and there was no one in sight. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my reading, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew clearer the longer I listened. It was a man's voice, soft but distinct. "Help me." I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. The room was silent, but the voice seemed to echo in my head. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe a dream I hadn't fully woken from. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." The words sent chills down my spine. I quickly grabbed my phone and called Charles, the landlord, desperate for an explanation. "Charles, there's something wrong with the house. I keep hearing voices at night," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was different, tense, almost guarded. "I should have told you about the house," he said, his voice quiet. "It's been in the family for generations, but there's something you need to know. A long time ago, a man named Victor lived there. He was the previous owner before me." I waited, holding my breath. "Victor was troubled," Charles continued. "He was a war veteran, came back from the war in the 1940s. He'd seen things, horrible things, and it changed him. The house was never the same after he moved in. People who lived there said they could hear him talking to someone, but no one ever saw who he was talking to. He died in the house alone." I felt a wave of unease wash over me. "What happened to him?" "They say he died in the living room," Charles said, his voice cracking. "But the thing is, they never found his body. It just disappeared." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to ask more questions, but the conversation felt heavy, like I was digging into something I wasn't meant to understand. Charles assured me that he had never experienced anything strange in the house himself, but I could tell from the way he spoke that he was hiding something. Something about Victor's death didn't sit right with him. The next few nights were unbearable. I couldn't sleep without hearing the whispers, the same voice calling out for help. Sometimes, I'd wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom. Each time I opened the door, there was nothing there. I started avoiding certain parts of the house, the living room especially. The air in there always felt heavy, as if something was waiting. It wasn't long before I began seeing things, or rather, someone. At night, when the lights were dim, I'd catch glimpses of a figure in the corner of my vision, a tall man with broad shoulders, his face always obscured by shadows. He never seemed to move, but I could feel him watching me. One night, I decided to confront it. I gathered all the courage I had and went into the living room, determined to find out what was going on. The air was colder than usual, and as I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop even further. Then I saw him. The man. He was standing near the fireplace, his back to me. I couldn't make out his features, but I could see his outline clearly. He was tall, wearing an old military-style jacket. For a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I called out to him, he turned slowly, revealing a face I'll never forget. His eyes were wide, hollow, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He didn't have a body, not in the way a living person does. He was just a shadow, an apparition that hung in the air, fading in and out like a poorly formed image on a broken television. The room was filled with a deep, oppressive silence as I stood frozen, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at him, but when I finally forced myself to look away, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent again. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things the next day, not even caring about the mess I was leaving behind. I told Charles I was moving out, but he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and wished me well, almost as if he expected this outcome. I left the house, never looking back. But even now, sometimes I feel that same presence, that same chill in the air. The whispers haunt me in my dreams. And I can't shake the feeling that the man in the living room is still waiting for someone to help him. Maybe he's still there, lingering in the house, watching for the next tenant. Or maybe he's out there somewhere, following me. Either way, I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that house.
Next story.
I was never one to believe in the supernatural, but that all changed the night I moved into my new apartment. It was located in a historic building in the heart of the city, and I thought I was lucky to have found such a charming place at a reasonable price. The building was old, sure, but it had character. The floors creaked with age, the windows had that cloudy look that only time could give, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the neighbors through them. But I didn't mind. I loved the idea of living somewhere with history. The apartment itself was spacious. A large living room with high ceilings, a small kitchen tucked in the back, and a bedroom that overlooked a quiet street. The first night, I unpacked a few boxes, set up my bed, and collapsed into it, exhausted from the move. I was ready to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come so easily. It started small, just odd noises in the middle of the night. I'd wake up to the sound of something tapping lightly against the walls, almost like someone was gently knocking. I'd tell myself it was the pipes or the house settling, and eventually drift back off to sleep. But then it got worse. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home and immediately noticed something was off. The apartment was unnaturally cold, colder than usual. I hadn't touched the thermostat, so I assumed the heater was malfunctioning. But as I walked through the hallway, I realized that the air felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me. The silence was too thick, too complete. Even the usual sounds from the street outside seemed muffled, as though they were coming from far away. I shrugged it off, but as the days went by, I began to feel more and more uneasy in the apartment. At night, the noises became more frequent. Footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking open, even whispers that I couldn't quite understand. I started locking the bedroom door before going to bed, but that didn't seem to help. The feeling of being watched was constant. It was like I was never truly alone in the apartment, no matter how empty it was. One night, I was lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The air was thick with that oppressive silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I was on the verge of getting up and checking the place when I heard it. A soft, slow dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It came from the living room. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I was paralyzed with fear. The room felt colder, and my breath became shallow. I couldn't move. I couldn't even make a sound. All I could do was lie there, staring at the door, waiting for whatever it was to make its next move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, darker, as though something had shifted in the very air around me. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually exhaustion took over and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then I saw the marks, scratches, long, deep gouges running down the side of my bedroom door, like something or someone had tried to get in. That was when I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong with the apartment. Something was in the building with me. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't long before I started doing some research. I dug into the building's history, and what I found made my blood run cold. The building had been around for over 100 years, and in that time, it had seen its fair share of tragedy. The most disturbing part of its past was the story of the previous tenant. A woman had lived in the apartment I now called home. She had been a writer, someone well known in the literary community. But one night, she had simply disappeared. No one ever found her, and there were no signs of foul play. The only thing that remained was a series of eerie, unfinished manuscripts she had left behind, filled with strange, cryptic passages about voices in the walls, shadows in the corners of the room, and a presence that followed her wherever she went. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure. The feeling I had been experiencing wasn't just in my head. There was something in that apartment, something that didn't want me there. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I felt the temperature drop again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I walked to the window, thinking maybe the cold draft was coming in from outside, but the street below was quiet. No wind, no chill, just a sense of growing dread. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, dark and heavy, moved across the room. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was something else, something far worse. It stretched and twisted like it was alive, shifting and slithering along the walls, following the edges of the room. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I backed away, my legs shaking, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow moved closer, its shape growing more defined, more solid, and then it stopped. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. But I knew it was there, just beyond my sight, waiting, watching. That's when I heard it, soft at first, but growing louder. A whisper, a voice so low I could barely make it out. Leave. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand, and I knew I had to go. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed what little I could, and I left the apartment that night. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that place. I couldn't look back. I couldn't stay one more night. To this day, I don't know what was in that apartment, but I do know that it wasn't just the building that was haunted. It was the very air, the very walls themselves. Whatever had been left behind, whatever had taken root in that place was still there, and it still waits for the next person who dares to move in.
Next story.
I still can't explain it. I keep thinking about it, trying to find some reason, some logic that would make it all make sense. But there's nothing that can make sense of what happened that night. I've always lived a pretty ordinary life, worked a 9-to-5 job, paid my bills on time, never caused any trouble. I thought I had everything under control. But then I found that letter. It was a Friday, and I was going through my usual routine. I came home from work, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat down to check the mail. It had been a slow week. Nothing too exciting, just the usual bills and junk mail. I was about to toss everything into the recycling when I saw it. A plain white envelope, no return address, no stamp, just my name written in neat, almost too perfect handwriting. I opened it slowly, a knot forming in my stomach. I don't know why, but I had a strange feeling. The kind of feeling you get when something is off, but you can't pinpoint exactly what it is. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. On it, in the same neat handwriting, was one line. "You're not alone anymore." I sat there for a minute, staring at the words. It didn't make sense. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no clue as to who it was from. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the fact that I felt something, like I was being watched. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was standing just behind me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a prank. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft tapping at the window, the creak of the floorboards. Every time I would turn over, I expected to see something there, lurking in the shadows. By morning, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I had a busy day ahead of me, and I needed to focus. So I went to work, tried to push the letter and the strange feeling to the back of my mind. But when I came home that night, I found something that made my blood run cold. The letter was back on the kitchen counter. The same envelope, the same handwriting, the same message. You're not alone anymore. I froze. I had thrown it away earlier that morning, I was sure of it. But somehow it had come back. And this time, there was something else in the envelope. Another piece of paper. It was a photograph. I took it out carefully, my hands shaking. It was a picture of me. At first, I didn't recognize it. It looked like it had been taken years ago, back when I still lived with my parents. But what struck me was the background. It was the backyard of the house where I grew up. I hadn't been there in years. I stared at the picture, trying to figure out where it had been taken. And then it hit me. The shadow. There, just behind me, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was a figure. A tall, thin figure with dark, almost black eyes, standing so still that it was almost as if it were part of the shadows. My heart raced. I didn't know who or what it was, but the fact that someone had been there, watching me, it made my stomach churn. That night, I tried to do what I always did: lock the doors, close the windows, and try to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see the figure in the photograph. I could feel its presence, like it was lurking just outside my door, waiting for me. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a tap on the door, barely audible. But over the next few hours, it grew louder, faster. The knock was steady, almost rhythmic, like someone was waiting for me to answer. I didn't dare move. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, my eyes glued to the door. My mind raced with questions. Who was doing this? Why me? What did they want? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I lay there in the dark, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. Every instinct told me to get up and leave the house, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to do anything except wait for whatever was coming next. Finally, after what felt like hours, I forced myself to check the door. I tiptoed down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything through the peephole. The porch light was out, casting the yard in darkness. But when I opened the door, nothing was there. No one. Just the empty porch and the quiet of the night. But something wasn't right. I could feel it in the air. Something was different. I stepped outside, looking around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting to jump out at me. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of my vision, in the corner of the yard, there was a figure standing. Tall, thin, and still, just like in the photograph. I could barely make out its shape in the darkness, but I knew it was there. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, but when I finally turned to run, the figure was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and bolted every window. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was being hunted. The days after that were a blur. I tried to keep up with my work, tried to keep a semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That figure, always just out of reach, always lurking at the edge of my sight, was never far from my mind. And then, one day, I found another letter. It was on my desk at work, slipped into a stack of papers like it had always been there. The handwriting was the same, the message the same: you're not alone anymore. But this time, there was something different. On the back of the paper, in small, neat letters, was a final sentence: I'm always with you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked around the office, my heart racing. I didn't know who was doing this or how they knew so much about me, but I knew one thing: I couldn't outrun them. Not anymore.